By March, Germany had occupied Czechoslovakia and established dominance elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Watching events unfold, the king became convinced war was unavoidable. To his relief, his prime minister now took the same view. Chamberlain warned Germany that if Britain was challenged, she would fight.
Is to reason. We are prepared to listen and not to force.
He also informed the Polish government that if Germany attacked its borders, Britain would come to its aid.
Canada gives her welcome with a boom of a royal salute.
As the tension increased in Europe, King George and Queen Elizabeth set sail for Canada and the United States in May 1939. The purpose of the trip was to strengthen the alliance between Britain and North America ahead of what was now perceived as certain war. As the tour continued, so the Duke of Windsor pursued his own policy of unhelpful interference. In that same month, he broadcast an appeal for world peace directed at America. The Duke later claimed he was prompted to speak as he too believed Europe was on the slope to war, and that only the Americans could stop the slide. If the Duke of Windsor thought his action might find favor at home, he was wrong. It only strengthened resistance to the prospect of him and the Duchess returning to England. By August 1939, it was not a case of if, but when war would begin. On the 1st of September, Germany invaded Poland.
Poland's agony has come.
Britain declared war with Germany on the 3rd of September. That same day, the king made the first of many speeches to the nation and empire at a time of war. It was considered by many to be his most significant contribution to the war effort.
This message is spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. There may be dark days ahead, and war can no longer be confined to the battlefield. And then, with God's help, we shall prevail. May He bless and keep us all.
With war declared, there remained the persistent problem: what to do with the Duke of Windsor.
For the quiet rest of England's countryside, we welcome back the Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
The Duke offered his services to his country, and the King agreed to a meeting to discuss a war job. It was their first encounter since the abdication. Edward was offered a liaison post in France, a job with which he quickly became dissatisfied. France fell to the Germans in June 1940.
The complete collapse of France follows swiftly.
The Duke and Duchess of Windsor fled Paris for Madrid. Though they were invited to return home to England, the Duke made his customary demand that he could only go back if the family receive and recognize his wife as Her Royal Highness, and if he was given a proper job. The British government objected to the Duke's demands. Instead, Edward and his Duchess were forced to leave Europe.
From the American liner Excalibur to the steps of the Royal Bermuda Yacht Club landing come the Duke and Duchess of Windsor on a visit to Government House, Hamilton. The Duke is on his way to take up his post as Governor and Commander-in-Chief of the Bahamas.
The Duke's new job was a sentence of banishment and bitterly resented by the Windsors. The couple, though, remained in the Bahamas for the rest of the war. Their departure from Europe had been executed before the Germans had managed to detain the Duke in Spain. Hitler had contemplated using the Duke as a weapon in the event of a successful invasion of England or in peace negotiations. It was later revealed that the Duke told German officials he favored making peace with Britain's enemy, and he believed war could have been avoided. The perception of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor as Nazi sympathizers ran deep.
The Duchess and I are naturally very glad to set foot in America again.
If the British government wanted the Duke out of the way, American intelligence was secretly monitoring the couple as it suspected the Duke and Duchess of passing sensitive information to the Nazis. There were even disputed rumors that Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazis' foreign minister, had been the Duchess's lover when he was ambassador in Britain in 1936, and that she remained in constant contact.
Ribbentrop, when he was ambassador in London, sucked up to her a lot. But how much she sympathised with him, I don't know. I don't think she was a political person. She was a social person.
I think that the FBI, they have files on everybody, and a lot of accusations are banded around. There's no question about it that plots were forming around the Windsors, and there were a lot of people speculating as to how they could be used in one way or another. But I don't personally believe that the Windsors were involved in any of these things.
It was also alleged by an FBI agent that Hitler's deputy Hermann Göring had reached a deal with the Duke that after Germany won the war, he would overthrow Hitler and return the Duke to the throne of England, something even the Duke understood would not be possible. The Duke was undoubtedly politically naive. His desire to have a public role led him to make a series of ill-advised blunders. But now exiled in the Bahamas, in reality he and the Duchess had little scope for covert maneuverings. Victory in Europe was declared on the 8th of May 1945. In London, large crowds gathered to celebrate.
Today is Victory in Europe Day. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
The King and Queen, together with their daughters, made 8 appearances on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, each time receiving a rapturous reception. There was, too, the King's victory speech. His Majesty's voice had become the sound of a familiar friend helping to unite a nation during a time of war. Ironically, and due mostly to his own exhaustion, of all the King's war speeches, the victory speech proved the hardest to deliver.
At this hour, when the dreadful shadow of war has passed far from our hearths and homes in these islands, we may at last make one pause for Thanksgiving, and then turn our thoughts to the tasks all over the world which peace in Europe brings with it.
It was a very emotional time, and he was not a well man. I think even by that time you could see that his health was beginning to suffer. So all that could have contributed, but it could have just been the normal kind of a nadir of the sinus curve of speech fluency, which most people who stammer simply experience.
War over, the issue of what to do with the Duke of Windsor resurfaced.
In conversation, the Duke has made it plain that the present move to Paris has nothing permanent about it. He is set on bringing his wife to his homeland.
Whatever he made plain, it was not to be. His wartime record had not endeared him to the King or his government, so a return to England was not an option.
You cannot have two kings, and you couldn't have two kings back in England. I mean, he was longing to come back to England and live at Fort Belvedere, reinvent himself as a younger brother of the king, and bring the Duchess of Windsor into the House of Windsor, etc. But it would always have been on his own terms, and he would always have been difficult.
Barred from returning home, the Duke and Duchess settled back in France, where they would remain for the rest of their lives. The Duke continued to visit his mother on a regular basis. For her part, Queen Mary hoped for a thaw in the relations between her 2 eldest children. But the Duke's continuing insistence on his wife's acceptance into the royal family remained a barrier to any reconciliation between Edward and the king.
He just had lost all respect for his brother. His brother was a sort of nightmare sitting on his shoulder. There was nothing of the closeness that there had been. And I think he felt that his brother had behaved appallingly. That he'd let down the family, he'd let down the country, he'd let down the empire. For what?
King George's health deteriorated. The strain of war, his nervous disposition, and perhaps most significantly his chain smoking, had taken their toll.
And so it seems fitting that the last pictures ever taken of King George VI should be at this family leave-taking.
The king died in February 1952, aged just 56. There had been no rapprochement between the Duke and the King. The elder brother's request to visit the King and Queen in the months preceding the monarch's death had been rejected. The Queen held the Duke partly responsible for the King's ill health and untimely passing.
The Queen Mother and certainly Princess Margaret took the view that, the fact that he had to take on those responsibilities did shorten his life. There's plenty of evidence also, of course, that he had cancer and, that he'd been smoking too much and things, but I suppose you could also argue that he wouldn't have felt the need to smoke so much if he had been leading a relatively quiet life as a younger brother of the King.
During his visit to England for his brother's funeral, the Duke did meet Queen Elizabeth, now the Queen Mother. But Queen Mary's wish that the family feud might now be over was over-optimistic. The Duke and the Queen Mother met only a few times during the 20 years between her husband's and the Duke's death. Queen Mary died in 1953. 14 years later, in 1967, and at the invitation of his niece, Queen Elizabeth II, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor attended the unveiling of a plaque in memory of Queen Mary at Marlborough House in London. It was the first meeting between the Duchess and the Queen Mother since before the abdication. There would be only one more meeting between the two women, at the Duke's funeral. The Duke of Windsor died in Paris in May 1972, but he was granted his stated wish to be buried at Frogmore Cemetery in Windsor. At the Queen's invitation, the Duchess came to stay at Buckingham Palace for the funeral.
The Duchess of Windsor was, of course, very scared coming to London for the funeral because, she didn't really know her husband's family particularly well, and she was particularly worried about meeting the Queen Mother. And Lord Mountbatten said to her that actually the Queen Mother had lost her own husband, so she knew perfectly well how she felt, and she felt very sympathetic towards her, which would be the way the Queen Mother would have responded to such a thing.
The Duchess died at home in Paris in April 1986. She had lived the life of a recluse for her last 10 years. Her body was flown to England, and after a funeral attended by the royal family, including the Queen Mother, she was buried next to her husband.
I did once say to the Queen, I think we ought to put up a statue to Mrs. Simpson. What do you mean? She said. Well, I said, if we hadn't had her, we wouldn't have had you. She laughed. Yes, luckily.
Public opinion remained divided about the Queen Mother's responsibility for the estrangement of the Windsors. For her part, the Queen Mother, reflecting on the Duke and Duchess in her own last years, said, "The only good thing is I think he was quite happy with her." As for her husband, George VI, although forever haunted by his brother, the king reluctantly embraced a role he didn't want and made it his own.
The French ambassador to London at the time of George's death said, if the greatness of a king is in line with the needs of the country at the time, then George VI was a great king and perhaps even a very great king.